Hello, this is Stella from Left on Red Media, and this is Bread and Roses, the political podcast for the intellectually and aesthetically curious. With me today, I have Joe Hill, Policy Director for Reform Think Tank. That's a think tank, nothing to do with the Reform Party, who will be talking to me about his recent paper on everythingism and the many hazards of working in the civil service, and whether it is fair or unfair that political talking heads refer to the civil service and Westminster more generally as the blob. So, hello, Joe. Thank you for being here with me. It is customary for every policy conversation in Westminster in 2025, and I think it was the case in 2024 as well, to always start with showing our respect to the 100 million pounds that were spent by the government building a bat tunnel during the HS2 project. And I believe that your paper, Everythingism, explains some of the reasons why this happened. So can you tell me, what is everythingism?
So everythingism is the belief in Westminster that every government policy can be made about every other government policy all at the same time, everywhere at once, and that there's nothing wrong with that. That in fact, in many cases, that's good and that's preferable. But you know, people who kind of believe in everythingism, this term we've coined, believe there are no trade-offs whatsoever to taking lots and lots of different policies and trying to combine them all the time. And I think that's not true. I think there are plenty of trade-offs. We see them every day. And the bat tunnel is a really, really good example of how high the cost can get of those trade-offs. The cost isn't always money. Most of the time, I think everythingism is why nothing really seems to work at all. Whether it's money, whether it's services are bad to access, whether it's projects never get delivered. It's kind of this malaise in policy making, this kind of intellectual hole we've gone down, and I think it's a really bad thing.
So basically it means that every department or policymaker who tries to make a policy, civil servant or whoever else, maybe they will be tasked, maybe their aim, for example, let's say, is to in the case of HS2, for example, you have a project group whose aim is to build HS2, but they have to, at the same time, protect the environment, which is something that sounds quite nice, quite good. But how can you explain to me, how did we end up in a situation where projects like that have to layer all of these different requirements?
Yeah. So in the US, many of your viewers will be familiar with the New York Times writer Ezra Klein, who's written a book out recently. And a few years ago, he coined a phrase which has kind of been part of the inspiration for this essay, everything bagel liberalism, where he talks about how it's particularly a feature of blue states and blue cities that an increasingly kind of democratic federal government in the US, that they layer kind of requirement after requirement after requirement on top of a policy. Now, this is particularly common in the US kind of, pork barrel politics system, where in Congress, requirements get added and added on top of legislation to kind of create these huge challenges. And he talks a lot about how affordable housing doesn't get delivered because of endless stipulations on it. He also talks about how new semiconductor fabs in the US can't be built because of really complicated requirements about workforce retraining. These are two quite good American examples, and what they illustrate, and with British examples like the Bat Tunnel or Anglesey Nuclear Power Station, many others, is that everything rarely kind of happens overnight. What it is the accumulation of what I call in the essay plus one-isms. These kind of stakeholder groups or vested interests, or just your colleagues and policymakers who come along with like one more idea, and on the face of it, that seems like a good extra idea, right, or an important thing we have to factor in, and so you kind of agree to take that on, or you have it kind of thrust upon you, but it becomes part of your policy. But the issue is it never just stops at one, and everythingism is the accumulation of many different plus one-isms over a really long period of time, and particularly the enshrining of some of these in law.
Do you think that has something to do with British culture? Like, obviously, you mentioned one example there, Anglesey power station. Is that the one where they didn't want to build it because the New Yorkers would not be Welsh speakers?
Yes.
Or they thought that if too many new people move in, then the Welsh language will start disappearing. So. And obviously, so you read Ezra Klein's book, yeah. So I finished it last week, and I enjoyed it a lot. But I always thought that there is something about the British temperament, and there is something specific about the civil service, and the fact that it is such an old institution, which has been improving the way that it works through the centuries, really. And this is why you are ending up with what looks like a very bloated bureaucracy, because every bureaucracy will end up being bloated. Every human organization will end up being a bit sclerotic.
Yeah, I think we see common characteristics in lots of other countries in the world and how they make policy. I think I'm more familiar with examples from kind of the Anglosphere, particularly, the US or other countries where we have a parliamentary democracy. Recently the government in New Zealand's adopted a very similar procurement policy to the one we have in this country, particularly around social value procurement, which is something I discuss in the essay. And they've had pretty negative results from that as well. So it's not a common British problem. I think there are maybe some elements of the kind of British temperament, and particularly the temperament of our institutions, that do kind of encourage a bit of everythingism. The civil service I worked in is broadly quite a kind of non-confrontational environment, where internal disagreement and challenge is not always really encouraged. You're seeing some of this come out in the evidence of the COVID inquiry at the moment. We know from that evidence that we were meant to have lots of plans on the stocks for a national emergency of a very similar kind to a pandemic. Those plans hadn't really been rigorously tested. And one of the government chief scientific advisors at the time, in her evidence, has talked about how civil service culture didn't really allow for the kind of challenge of other people that she was used to as a scientist professionally. I think there's some truth in that, both as a British thing and also the institutions we rely on for our policy making are just a little bit averse to really pushing people on, hang on a second, is that a good idea?
Do you agree with Dominic Cummings calling Westminster the blob?
I don't think Cummings is the first to call it the blob, and he definitely won't be the last. The blob's a very loaded term, but on balance, I think it is helpful sometimes, because what it gets at for people is the sense that this set of institutions is somehow more than the sum of their parts. That, the civil service, I believe, it has loads and loads of people in it who show up every day wanting to do a really good job for their country, but the kind of the systems and processes and institutions we make them work in somehow like sap a lot of that vitality, that talent and that energy and that drive, and take people who meant to do something really good and often mean that they don't really do much at all.
How does that happen?
So a whole bunch of ways. I think if I were to pick out a couple, the civil service is a very insular organization. It's still relatively full of people who've spent their whole careers in that institution, or most of it. Quite recently, it was the case that of people appointed to jobs in the sort of senior civil service, only about 20% of them came from outside of government. Remaining 80 had previously been working in government. And I think what that speaks to is an organisation where people are very used to working in the ways they always have done. And in some ways that's good. I'm not of the view that like running a country is similar to running private companies. These things are very, very different. But it does mean you're just not quite so adaptable to a changing world, and maybe not so adaptable to other perspectives. And I think that over time that means these things are very homogenous. People tend to think and act in the same way. They learn behaviors from others, and when you all kind of get together, there can be a bit of groupthink.
Okay, let me be a bit of a small C conservative for a second and play devil's advocate. For one, would you not say that there is something about institutional memory, and there is something that is actually quite positive about people having their entire career in the same place, and being able to see how this place changes and remembering how they managed to do things? For example, in the Labour Party, this was a big complaint before the last elections about the new Labour government now, and I would be interested to hear your thoughts on how they're doing. Because there wasn't as much institutional memory. There weren't people in the Labour Party who had worked in a Labour government before. And also the thing with everything is you are advocating that we have people who are more specialist and they focus on solving specific problems. Aren't we then running the danger that there will be cases where people do not take into consideration things that they do not know because they've simply never experienced them?
Totally. I think on the institutional memory point, I think that would be true in an ideal world, but actually I think what we have at the moment is kind of the worst of two possible extremes. I think the civil service both is not very good at being permeable to kind of outside talent, and also has a pretty mixed track record of professionalizing the core things that only it can do, right? Like, outside of the civil service, there are very few people who've ever been involved in passing a bill through Parliament, because that's really something only, government and a small number of people working for the House of Parliament have done. There are very few people who have tried to add up the economy and the public finances in the way that the Treasury has to. There are very few people who've dealt with the kind of very niche regulation that, for example, departments like the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs have to. Lots of this is very specialised to government, but we don't treat those as serious professional expertise-led things anyway. And actually, if you look at the career of most civil servants, and certainly many of my peers when I was there, you'd see that they kind of bounce around on jobs where there's very little accumulation of any actual.
But was there surely, again, I'm being a small C conservative, don't tear down a fence unless you know why it's there. Isn't there a reason why this has become the culture in the civil service? A malevolent reason.
I'm not sure a malevolent reason, maybe an accidentally malevolent reason. I think that the civil service is a pretty chaotic set of institutions. It's effectively a profession of like 540,000 people. It's a lot of people. The very core of it where I worked, there's maybe kind of 20,000 people in what you would think of as Whitehall, right? Kind of trying to run ministerial departments and advise ministers. And we've got to this place where they're all constantly moving around and chopping and changing and trying to fill roles that someone else has just moved out to go and work on some emergency project. Now, that's sort of a good thing. It's very adaptable. It can flex at very quick notice to kind of get people on urgent things and to get good people on it. But I think it has lots of long-running unintended consequences. One is we don't have that kind of core institutional memory in some key areas. I think on everything, as you asked about unintended consequences, and I do think this is really important. It's one of the main things people have asked me about the essay since we published it. Many of the processes I kind of critique in the essay are in theory, are designed to avoid unintended consequences of kinds. That they mandate the use of impact assessments of various kinds at any stage of policy making. They add a lot of layers, a lot of checks and balances. And I don't think policymakers should ignore complexity at all. The world is very complex. The world of making public policy is incredibly complex and probably is getting more complex over time. So they shouldn't do that. I think what we're kind of driving at is that some of that needs to be counterweighted and balanced, right? We need to take a risk-based approach to some of this. And I think it's clear that many of the ways that we ask for example, environmental impact assessments are both not very good for getting projects built, but also not very, very good for protecting the environment. And, to give you an example, plenty of the major infrastructure projects that get blocked on environmental grounds are clean energy projects of some kind, or nuclear power stations. We know that in the long run, the only way we're going to be able to protect the environment is to transition to more sustainable kinds of energy. It kind of, in many ways, we've let everythingism get in the way of the very thing we wanted in the first place by saying we have to reject it at this kind of extreme local level.
What it sounds to me, and as someone who comes from a non-British culture, I feel like a lot of this has to do with the fact that the UK has a history and a reputation about sticking to the rules and about organizing things, and the civil service is an example of that. And people will complain a lot about corruption in the UK, but really the British government and the British civil service are one of the least corrupt countries in the entire world, and there is a reason why other governments look at the UK as an example. But what it feels like to me, the reason why you have so many codified responsibilities to make all of these checks on all of these different policy aims is because it is very difficult for unelected people to take accountability for decision making. So if you didn't have all of these different checks and balances, then whoever is at the helm of whichever department would have to take responsibility for all of the unintended consequences. Whereas by codifying all of these different policy aims, you are saying, look, we've done all of the security checks, whatever. So if we end up polluting, or if we end up with people feeling like they are less safe, or with people not having anywhere to live, then it is not our fault. We need to improve the system.
Definitely. It's something we draw out a bit in the essay. There's a really good book that came out quite recently called The Unaccountability Machine by Dan Davis, which I kind of encourage all of your listeners to read, because I think it explains a lot of these phenomena. He talks about how bureaucracies have kind of estranged us from individual accountability by creating so many processes, and this would be particularly true in the public sector, but it's also true in large parts of the private sector, which we sort of outsource decision making to. You'll have experienced this if you're in any one of those situations where you're at an airport, or you're dealing with security at something, or whatever it is, and they say, I'm sorry, I can't do that, that's our policy. And if you say to them, oh, I'd like to speak to your line manager, then they say, can speak to my line manager, and whether or not you do, the manager says, I'm sorry, I also can't make that decision. That's our policy. And one of the reasons we've done that, I think, is because it's a comfortable place for people to be. The more you outsource decision making to policies and to rules, and government put some of those rules in legislation, there's a comfortable way in which really no one is at fault when something goes wrong. And so we get to this position where ministers in this country, or senior officials, can feel like their hands are kind of tied by the everythingism they find themselves in. And one of the things I sort of point to in the essay is, I think for a lot of people that's quite comfortable, right? Because their hands weren't tied by the everythingism. They would actually have to do things. And that can be very uncomfortable if you get them.
This book has this horrifying example, which is I think it was from an airport in the Netherlands, maybe somewhere like that, where someone in their suitcase, they had was it baby squirrels or something like that, some kind of animal, some kind of baby animal, in like loads of them, and the officers at the costumes didn't know how to deal with them because there was no formal process, but they felt like their hands were tied because they couldn't take them. It was a health and safety risk, basically, because it was wild animals coming from abroad. So they ended up killing them in a really disgusting way.
I think, I can't remember quite. I remember it's very short. They threw them all into a shredder or something like that.
They shredded them.
And the example, he uses it as an example because it's very visceral. But the point is kind of the set of rules and policies they created meant that no one person really felt they had the authority to say, hang on, not going to actually do that.
Computer says no.
And I think that's how we get so much of this everythingism, is actually that there are lots of examples where people don't want to be held account for their judgment. There's an American writer called Jennifer Palker who I talk about a lot in my work, who has a great line, which I'm gonna not get quite right, about the federal civil service hiring in America, which is actually very similar to our problems in some ways, where she says, you know, they've created processes where no one's judgment can ever be questioned in hiring someone, because fundamentally no judgment was used, right? It's like, did they say this word? How many times did they say it? They say it enough. Well, then they get a score of 6 out of 10, and who scored the most? And, you know, it's the attempt to take all judgment out of decision making. And, you know, that judgment for me includes those kind of unintended consequences and expectations that you're talking about. Fundamentally, we need to find a more healthy way of thinking about what the unintended consequences might be, because at the moment, often it just paralyzes us.
Do you think AI will help automate all of that and just take all the pressure off from human beings using their brain to think of all the different parameters?
Good question. I certainly hope so, but I wouldn't rely on it. I still think that in the near term, you know, we're going to be relying on human decision makers to make the kind of executive decisions, probably, you know, relatively unaided by software for the next few decades. I kind of hope we manage to introduce a bit more codified processes and ways of making those judgments. I hope that we kind of can get machine learning to help us doing that, but I certainly don't think it's going to get us out of this situation by ourselves. You know, people got us into this, and people are going to have to get us out of it.
Have you heard of the Labour Party phrase from Bevin, was I think who said it? The language of priorities is the religion of socialism, which it doesn't quite mean what it sounds like, but it's something that.
What does it mean?
What it was meant to what he meant to say was that it was, because if you read the rest of the text, it says that that means that you have to be the language of priorities is the religion of socialism, which means that you have to be very unemotional when you are making your judgments about what you are prioritizing. And you have to do this, you know, you have to be a patron figure, basically, for the society and the community that you're looking after and the country that you're looking after. Whereas the way that we use it a lot now is like with the welfare cuts, for example, and I use it myself, or with whenever the government has to say, oh, we can't spend on, you know, the poor because we have to spend on guns or whatever. I'm simplifying it, but this is usually how we use it now. And it reminds me a lot of what Edmund Burke says in one of his essays about a book, actually, but I haven't read the whole book, about beauty. And it's about his conservative concept of how do you evaluate beauty. And he was describing how human beings basically use user judgment, and you have to be discriminatory to see value in something and to use your judgment. And judgment cannot be devoid of emotion, because judgment is value is about what you experience as more important. So the two are inherently connected, which is all to say, the reason why I mention this is because this is why some decisions you cannot have an AI decide on. And this is the same that we used to speak of AI the same way that we speak about AI right now, the same way we used to talk about technocrats. 15, 20 years ago, when the financial crash happened, it became very popular in politics to speak about how we need to have less populist politicians and more technocrats. Because if we had technocrats who are very, very good at how the financial markets work, how the industry works, they are trained economists in behavioral psychology and whatever else, then they will be able to give you the exact formula about how to deliver the kind of policies and results that you want. But now we speak about AI in the same way. We think that AI is going to come and save us. I feel like nobody's coming to save us. We have to save ourselves. But tell me, to move on from this, how do you feel the Labour Party is doing? Keir Starmer, obviously, he has promised that he's going to completely reform the civil service. Do you think he's managing to do that?
I think it's early days, but the kind of most surprising thing to me and to other kind of Whitehall watchers who try and unpick these problems is probably how quickly the government have ended up here. I think if you wind the clocks back a year, and we're facing down a general election that we don't know the answer to, but we're pretty confident where it's going to go. I wouldn't have anticipated that a new Labour government would quite as quickly have got to the place of, really talking about, thinking about, planning for rewiring the state in the way that they currently are. I think that speaks to a few things. I think it probably speaks to their experience since getting into power, and some of the kind of Labour insiders who I know are kind of very candid in how frustrating they have found it, right? How kind of, to use the old, I think it's a Tony Blair line, that, you try and pull the kind of levers of politics and you find that nothing really happens. Those levers aren't obviously attached. The levers aren't obviously attached to anything. And so they've got in and they've found that instead of a kind of Rolls-Royce civil service, which is perfectly ready to execute all of their plans, actually it's a mixed picture. There are some really good bits, there are some pretty bad bits, and there are some big problems. I think they've also found, they've realised the scale of the pressure. I think there are sort of probably some people in the Labour Party who thought that the reason why public services were in a real mess was in part because, to simplify it, the nasty Conservatives are kind of evil, and if we get in, we'll be good, and that will make things work again. And yet that's not been their experience. For example, on the NHS, it's been very hard for them to make kind of the progress that they're starting to make. And so I think that those experiences have really shaped the government. They've shaped it quite quickly, and they've got it to the stage where the Prime Minister's now made two really, really big interventions on the need for civil service reform, as has Pat McFadden. And I think that...
Which are? Tell us.
So the one that the Prime Minister got in a bit of trouble for back in December when they kind of launched the plan for change was that I think the exact line was that there are too many civil servants who are comfortable in the tepid bath of managed decline, which I think is a sort of odd turn of phrase. It's probably not the one I would have used. I also don't think it's a particularly kind of unkind or really unfair criticism of the civil service. I mean, he's talking about a relatively small number of people, and comfortable in the tepid bath of managed decline is about the nicest not nice thing that anyone is ever going to say about you. But of course, it caused a kind of huge, explosion of outrage from the civil service unions in particular, and I think he had to kind of write a letter slightly rowing back on his position, which I think was unfortunate. And then if you wind the clocks forward to March, he gave a big speech where he announced, amongst other things, bringing NHS England back in-house from being, what I think Wes Streeting called the world's biggest quango to being, back directly in the Department for Health and Social Care under his management. He also mentioned taking a kind of wider, sort of bonfire of the quangos approach to many of these public bodies, which are sort of slightly outside of ministerial control. They've had a particular focus on some of the ones which are statutory consultees and often block the government or local authorities from delivering more housing and more infrastructure projects, for example. And he's also talked a lot about kind of civil service talent and performance management, which is something we at the think tank have written a lot about. The civil service, generally speaking, removes very, very few people for poor performance compared to most of the economy. And I think it's a matter for public confidence, basically, that, it's very hard to tell them with a straight face that, almost every single civil servant is doing a really, really good job of their job at their job all the time.
At the same time, though, I feel like it's quite difficult if you are a politician in a democratically elected country. And if you are, you're saying that you want to attract more talent in the civil service. How are you going to attract more talent if our politicians and our leadership figures, and you have, are constantly touching them down, and you have Dominic Cummings writing in his blog that they are all, a bunch of useless, expletives?
So I'm going to challenge you there. I'm not sure I buy that distinction, because I don't think that is what the Prime Minister, and even I think what Dominic Cummings says
I think
about
Keir
it.
Starmer has been very constrained until,
I think for the kinds of really exceptional people outside of government, actually probably one of the most off-putting things about the civil service is the idea that they would end up going and working in an institution where they, as a someone at any level, right, we're not necessarily talking about leaders of these organizations, wouldn't really have the power to manage it, which is the experience of a lot of people in the civil service. Many civil servants I talk to in my work, my research, tell me how unbelievably frustrated they are when the HR processes tie their hands and they can't effectively performance manage people, they can't effectively remove people if they aren't able to do their jobs. And I think for really exceptional people who've done big things, they recognize that a government needs to take performance and talent seriously, and that's the kind of organization they want to work in.
Don't you think that HR more generally in the UK is like, I feel like, so I saw the same with people staying in the same position and never leaving it in the third sector as well. And I've heard similar stories from the private sector. And something that I also think is true is that it's not just that you can't get rid of people, but it's also the fact that there really aren't as many good quality jobs anymore. So a lot of people do not feel as motivated to advance in their careers in the same way that they would in a more dynamic environment.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack in it. I certainly think that, I think the stats I saw the other day were that we as a country have the second biggest percentage of jobs in the economy being in HR roles, private sector, public sector, third sector, in every role in the world, right? So second biggest after the US. It's if the US is top, it's not surprising to me that we're the second, because I think in many ways we're kind of culturally and economically quite downstream of the United States still. But these are, in the private sector, in the public sector, professions that have grown hugely in the last few years. And I think there's definitely a big job for the government to do in working out how it creates an economy of really high-paying, high-rewarding, successful jobs. But I also think that the growth of HR is partly about what we were talking about earlier, is partly about, can we kind of create systems and processes and policies and rules and professional people to kind of manage us through those, which effectively take the judgment away from managers and senior leaders. It's very easy for people to say, oh, I can't do anything about it, HR have told me I can't. And in some ways they might moan like that, but if they didn't have that excuse, they might have to have some really difficult conversations.
Yeah, does it come back to the accountability trap that you were talking about, just being not wanting to take accountability for making these decisions, and also not wanting to do something that's quite difficult and awkward for a lot of people, which is have an honest feedback conversation. Which again, it brings me back to, we speak about these things as if, the problem is not that, it's just that we are not being as brutal towards our workforce as the US is. And I still don't feel that's the case, because I still feel like a bigger problem in the UK is just how the opportunities have just not been there. The fact that people in the civil service and people in the kind of professions that would feed into the British service have seen their wages stagnating for the last 15 years in the same way, actually, as much of the rest of the economy.
Definitely, yeah. I think it's, we aren't in a position at the moment where there are very few jobs in the country. We have very high numbers of vacancies, lots of jobs unfilled. And one of the big economic challenges for us is that lots of people are working in relatively low wage, low productivity jobs. and either can't seem to get to the higher wage, higher productivity jobs, or they don't want to in some cases. Now, there's a lot going on in that and a lot to unpack. But I think the government are thinking about this, take it very seriously, and they're obviously bringing legislation around the workers' rights bill, which is in Parliament at the moment. I think that there are versions of this that are quite extreme and can take us in the wrong direction. And certainly, there have been a couple of cases recently of European and French-based, American tech companies which are operating in France, where they have tried to remove employees from their workforce. I don't know the reasons why. Could be performance related, could be downsizing, could be redundancies. And the French courts have ruled where you've got to pay them over a year's worth of severance pay. And one of the challenges we have in getting high-paid, high-productivity jobs into this country, if we do go down the route of really strengthening employment rights to a high degree, as lots of those jobs come from internationally based organizations who might look at the UK and think, hang on, am I going to invest and hire a load of people in this country where if I want to downsize or I want to rejig my operation, I'm going to be caught paying huge severance packages. Now, we're not in that position at the moment. We're in we're somewhere between the European and US kind of employment terms and conditions. And I think that there's a danger in rushing to really solidify workers' rights in a way which actually just could mean a lot of those jobs we're really after don't exist at all.
Well, that was great, Joe. Thank you very much for coming on the pod.
All right. Thank you for having me.